It's actually the second session of that clinic with a very long name, linking and transitioning between non-contributory and contributory social protection for informal workers and beyond. So this is really a very long title, and I mean we've been thinking of how to best shorten it, but did fail in doing that. But let me just kind of, just as an introduction, just quickly say some words on what this clinic is about. So basically it is about, given that social protection, in social protection system, and I mean quite often we distinguish in a relatively blanket way between contributory schemes, and there, and when it comes to social protection, we mostly talk about social insurance, and non-contributory schemes, and there we kind of quite often we call it social assistance, but also being aware that there are different types of non-contributory schemes, especially also considering that quite many countries have universal non-contributory schemes like social pensions or universal child grants, for example, in addition to the kind of the social assistance in the more narrow sense that it's targeted to those who are living in poverty. And when we think about informal workers, they quite often fall through the cracks of both. Their situation is not necessarily a situation that can easily be covered by social insurance schemes, but at the same time, they fall through the cracks of social assistance schemes. So this is why we often call them the missing middle. And what we would like to discuss now in this clinic is really looking at the interactions between those schemes, the situation of workers, how they can be covered by one of them or by both, and also looking at the transitions between different schemes. And it might be two different contributory schemes, it might be between contributory, non-contributory, it might be different non-contributory schemes, and also the way how people might combine coverage of more than one scheme. And another point or another aspect that we would like to discuss is really a bit unpacking also the contributory schemes, considering especially that social insurance quite often includes some non-contributory elements, in the sense that there might be some aspects of it. There might be, for example, there might be a guarantee of minimum benefits. There might be subsidized contributions for those on low incomes, for example. And so also looking at these design features that can facilitate actually the coverage for workers in the informal economy, and can facilitate the extension to them. So, and all these mechanisms are important mechanisms to promote solidarity and risk sharing and avoid fragmentation and exclusion. And in that context also, I think it's important to not just look at the social protection systems in a narrow sense, but really look also at the broader policies and strategies that can help to promote the extension of social security coverage to those in the informal economy, and can also help to address some of the factors that trap people in the informal economy, and which avoid that they can move from the informal economy to the formal economy, at least in a kind of a medium and longer term perspective. And obviously gender is a key factor in that, and it's also very important to have a disability inclusive approach. So this is just to explain a bit some of the thinking that we had around that session as a matter of introduction. And I think with that, I'll hand over to Quinn to continue and present our colleagues here, or our experts who are here with us. And yeah, so please, Quinn.
Sorry, I had to unmute myself. Good afternoon, good evening, good morning to everyone. Welcome to the session, and thank you, Christina, for your introduction. I will just quickly introduce the format of the session and quickly introduce our designated resource persons. So this session is really intended to be an interactive session. We won't have a presentation, it will be questions, and in the beginning, we would like to encourage you to visit the Slido website, and I'll just post the link in a minute to type in your questions, and then we can have a hopefully very interesting and rich discussion. So I'm very delighted to welcome Laura Alphas. She's the director of the Social Protection Program at WeGo. And also welcome to Luca Pellerano. He's a senior social security specialist based in ILO Beirut. They are today here with us live. And then in addition to these two experts, we have other designated resource persons who will also be there later for you if you have questions in writing. And yeah, and those are Ludovico Carraro from Oxford Policy Management, Yasmina Papa and Nuno Cunha, also from the ILO team. And just to emphasize again that although we have experts or designated resource persons, you are really invited to share your experiences, and we learn from each other. It's a peer-to-peer discussion, so we would really like to hear from you as well. And yeah, I mean, we're looking forward to the discussion. So let me post the link to the Slido website in the chat. Oh, thank you, Marina. That's nice. So we will maybe give you, let's give each other like 5 to 7, 8 minutes to have a look at the questions. And then let me quickly see if I can present the Slido as well so that you can. So here you've already seen that this morning we already had a discussion with other peers in the same clinic. So here there were already questions typed in, and you can either type in your own question, and it would be nice if you could also type in your name so that we can later refer to it in the discussion or have a discussion in more detail. But you can also press here on a like so that a question you are interested in moves up and will be treated in priority. As you will see, we have many questions already, and yeah, and the discussion today, this morning, was really rich and interesting. So we're looking forward to having more questions. So I'm muting myself, and we'll talk to you in a bit.
Yeah, maybe while you're thinking about your question and while you're reading the questions which others have already put there, maybe just to add also that you can actually vote for questions. And so if you vote for questions, they are going to move up in the list, and that helps us also to see which are the questions which are of most interest to you. So, but maybe we'll give ourselves another couple of minutes for the questions, and then we go into the discussion. Yeah, maybe let's start the discussion actually, and we see that one of the questions that has really received most of the votes, that was also the really the top question when we had the discussion this morning, is really the very first one. And the question about giving some good examples of countries or initiatives that have been successful in attracting informal workers to contributory schemes. So although it's a bit of a repetition because we've already discussed that this morning, but I think this question has received so many votes that I think it might be worth really looking into that and spending some time with it. And maybe before asking the experts that we have on our panel, we would maybe like to ask the other participants first whether, I mean, would any of you have any interesting experiences that you would like to share with us? Any particular challenges that you have faced in that regard? So is there, would any of you like to come in? So, so who would be like to be the first to break the ice? No one? Okay, so in that case, maybe let's see. But would Laura or Luca, would you have any points to share on that particular question?
Yeah, well, let me kick off, and then I know Laura will come on with some more examples, and I think one first, let's say, consideration to make, and I don't know if I can now share my screen like we did before or not, but anyways, I guess one point, to kick off the discussion is really that we find useful to recognize the great diversity and heterogeneity in what we call the informal economy and in what we call informal workers. So really, when you look at what countries have done and what some of the successful experiences have been, in some countries these have been let's say, more successful in relation to specific segments of the workforce, specific sectors or specific work arrangements. I'm now struggling to talk and share at the same time, but so that's kind of a starting point for to frame the question. So we could really find around the world solutions that have responded to specific challenges for specific groups within the social, within informal workers. It's somehow difficult to put these pieces all together, although some of us have tried, and maybe Christine and Quinn can talk about this recent ILO guide on extension of coverage to the informal economy as one of the many resources available. The other general consideration is that barriers are also very diverse. So there are barriers in accessing social insurance, for example, that have more of a legal nature, but there are barriers that have to do more with affordability. There are barriers that have to do more with interest and suitability of this social insurance benefits to the characteristics of informal economy workers, and other barriers that have to do more with administration, with the way operations are set. So really, again, solutions have to do with dealing with all these different matters, with all these different layers and different typologies of barriers that that informal workers share. Now, in terms of maybe one concrete example that I would like to share, and maybe building a bit more on this morning's discussion and extending on it from the region I work in is Tunisia. So Tunisia is a country that has really managed to achieve quite significant increase in coverage of social insurance schemes in the past 10 years. We've seen the share of private sector workers covered rise from about 54% to what was estimated in 2017, 80%. So quite significant. And how has that been achieved? Really by devising schemes for specific categories of workers in the informal economy, but by allowing all these schemes to work in synergy under a single system. So within the private sector in Tunisia, there is a single fund for social security for private sector workers, but within that fund there are specific schemes, and those schemes are kind of somehow more directly geared to the characteristics and to the needs of specific sub-segments of the informal workforce. So there is a general scheme, there is a scheme for agricultural employees, there is a scheme for the self-employed, there is a scheme for workers abroad, there is a schemes for artists and other kind of creative, intellectual, intensive jobs, and there is a scheme for workers on low revenues, which includes domestic workers. So these schemes are somehow part of the same system, are in the same ecosystem. There is sharing of information across the schemes. There is some level of solidarity across these schemes, but they're also tailored. So there are specific features when it comes to the level of contribution, to the mechanism of collection of contribution. There are specific features when it comes to the benefit package that actually make those schemes more responding to the specific characteristics, needs, and context, and also to the respective role that employers and workers can play in contributing to the system, depending on where they sit in these puzzles. And I think this model, complemented by very significant investment in, let's say, measures to enhance compliance, workplace control, for example, in the case of cases where an employee-employer relationship can be established, but also by strong engagement of the professional organizations, of informal workers organizations have led to, as I say, quite significant success in terms of coverage increase. In addition to this, I would say one of the key elements of success has been the very strong and well-established tradition of social dialogue in Tunisia, where really there has been a strong participation of the labor movement, of the organizations of employers together with government in kind of national process of dialogue as to how through successive reforms the coverage of the whole social security system could be enhanced, as well as building synergy between health insurance, access to health, and access to other benefits. So really, since the time when, as part of these progressive reforms, access to the system has linked health insurance registration with other benefits, this really has boosted further extension of coverage. And we can come back to how and how, why and how these have happened. So I think if I have to pick one example, I'm quite inspired by the work of Tunisia. And of course, there are others in the region, but I will stop here and let others maybe come in and complement. Over.
Yeah,
thanks.
Oh, yeah, go. No, go.
I was just going to add, based on Luca's sort of presentation of a sectoral scheme in Tunisia, and it reminded me a little bit of what are called the workers' welfare boards in India. And these are fairly controversial, and they're not, the problem with the workers' welfare boards in India is they're not sort of consolidated under one single scheme and very well organized. There's sort of multiple welfare boards over multiple sort of groups for multiple groups of informal workers. And that's not necessarily, that kind of proliferation of schemes is not necessarily what you'd want to aim for. But I do think some of the workers' welfare boards in India are interesting examples of how you can set up industry or sector-specific schemes to reach certain groups of informal workers, because different groups of informal workers will have different financing solutions available to them. So, for example, if you're talking about domestic workers, there's an employer who potentially can contribute. I suppose the welfare boards that are most prevalent in India are the construction workers' welfare boards. And those are really interesting because you have a contribution from the lead contractor. So even though there is no formal employment relationship between the workers and the contractor, that contractor has to make a contribution into the welfare fund. And through that welfare fund, certain social security benefits are available for construction workers. There's also a BD workers board, and there are a couple of domestic workers welfare boards as well. And I think it just emphasizes the point that even though in the informal economy there aren't always very clear employment relationships, there are ways of getting contributions that are not just the workers contributing themselves or the state subsidizing that, right? And I think the creative ways of establishing economic relationships and drawing on economic relationships to assist with contributions to contributory schemes is an area that the ILO has been exploring it in Zambia already. But that definitely can be explored further through the gig economy as well. And I was earlier today presenting on a really interesting example we have from some waste pickers in Brazil who they have an economic relationship in the waste chain with an industry group of creating hygiene products. Under the solid waste management laws in Brazil, there's a regulation called extended producer responsibility, which means large manufacturers have the responsibility for dealing with their products at the end of life, so for recycling their products essentially. And waste pickers obviously contribute to that recycling effort at the end of the product's life. So there is, through that, they've been able to establish an economic relationship that is not necessarily an employer-employee relationship. And during the COVID crisis, they were able to leverage social protection benefits from industry to add to the social protection benefits provided through the state. So again, that's a small example, but again, another one just illustrating that when we're talking about contributory schemes, we can move beyond just the state and the worker, even when it comes to self-employed workers. But there are also examples, particularly from the world of health insurance that I spoke about this morning as well. Indonesia's big national health insurance scheme has relatively high coverage rates in the informal economy. I think, well over 70%. And Rwanda's community-based health insurance scheme also has a 94% coverage rate. And both of those are mandatory schemes, which is interesting. And I know that was a question that came up as to whether voluntary or mandatory works better. But the point about both of those schemes is if you are going to make them work where there's high levels of poverty and informality, there has to be a subsidized component to it, a non-contributory component to it. So in both of those cases, you'll see that there is, exemptions for workers who can't afford, or for people who can't afford the basic premiums. And in Indonesia, there are some groups of informal workers that have been classed as being able to receive the free healthcare. Although, again, the problem is the same with targeting, where you set the line of who qualifies for the free healthcare benefit and who has to contribute is always, it's hard to draw that line. And I know that home-based workers in Indonesia, for example, are one of their big arguments is, well, if the fishermen and the farmers can get the free healthcare subsidy, why can't home-based workers get that free subsidy as well? And I think as another issue is with these kinds of things is is the benefit enough? Is it worthwhile for the workers who are contributing? We've seen that in the Tanzania's national social security scheme, which was extended to informal workers for a very low premium. But many workers said, well, the benefits we'd receive in return is not really worth even that low amount that we're paying. So there are questions of what people are going to get in return, and also financial sustainability if you're subsidizing a lot of people on these schemes. Both of, I think, definitely the Rwandan case, for example, has big questions of financial sustainability hanging over it. But it is possible, and as I said this morning, I think the big question with contributory schemes is ultimately, by raising incomes, you're increasing people's contributory capacity. So we can talk about, well, how can we extend contributory schemes to informal workers? But if we're talking about poor people having to contribute to their social protection, we're going to just hit a floor quite quickly. We're going to hit a wall quite quickly. And if that isn't joined by a wider process to improve incomes, to improve employment conditions at the same time, I think there's always going to be limits on how far contributory schemes can go.
Yeah, thank you so much, Luca and Laura, for these kind of many examples. And I think they really highlight a lot of the key ingredients which can really help to meet that challenge of attracting informal workers into contributory scheme. I mean, you have mentioned quite a number of them. First of all, that the benefits need to be attractive to them, that they should meet their needs, that the processes should be simple, to really that also when it comes to the contributions, that obviously the contribution levels need to be adapted to their situation, and not just the levels, but also the modalities, in order really to reflect the volatility of people's incomes. I think that's a very important point. I think there is certainly a lot of scope to look, I mean, with all the importance of really looking at correctly reflecting an employment relationship where it exists. But I think there is also scope for having searching some innovative mechanisms to really make sure that there are mechanisms of financing that can really help in that respect. And you had mentioned the worker welfare boards, for example, in India, and I think there's a number of other examples as well. And I think then the question of the kind of the specificity in the sense of really having schemes that respond to the specificity of the situations of workers in a specific sector. But then also the question of avoiding too much fragmentation, making sure that there is solidarity also in the system. And I mean, I think that the example of Tunisia is indeed interesting in the sense that there is already quite a strong level of integration in the system. One could even drive it even further and have kind of one scheme, but in a way kind of different entry doors for different categories of workers to go into that scheme. So I think there's a lot of food for thought in that. And but maybe before moving to the next question, would maybe any of the other people that we have in the discussion here like to add anything and to bring in any other aspects? I mean, you can always also raise your hand and signal that you would like to intervene in the discussion. But if there's no specific question at the moment, I would maybe hand back to Quinn.
Christina?
Yes, through the next question.
I think someone raised or someone wanted to intervene, but I'm not sure.
I think there is a question from Fabio. I see Fabio unmute his microphone.
Please go ahead, Fabio. Fabio, probably he can't unmute himself. But actually, I had a question to you, Luca. So you mentioned the example of Tunisia, where there are different schemes for different types of occupations and different sectors, but they're all kind of part of the same system. And you also mentioned that there's also some elements of redistribution and solidarity. And so, I mean, am I understanding it right that they are not part of the same fund, or are they?
My understanding is that they're part of the same system, but there are different funds, but there are mechanisms for, let's say, cross-subsidization across these funds. So this operates as one single system. And I think that goes in the direction of what Christina was saying, of the importance of keeping, avoiding fragmentation in the sense of, which has an implication from the perspective of solidarity in financing and risk pooling. And one doesn't want to leave the informal workers alone on a corner of, let's say, the labor market and sharing risk amongst themselves. And that's why also kind of social insurance schemes at very small scale tend to become more expensive and more inefficient. So there are features in the system that allow for kind of this principle of more collective risk sharing and sharing in financing. Now, this said, I think that some of the challenges that remain with that approach, with the Tunisian approach, is, for example, on matters of labor mobility. I mean, we know that one of the features of informality is that informal workers tend to have more fluid careers and move from across sectors, from inside and outside the formal sector, at least in certain cases, and for some of them, and therefore that it becomes much harder to have kind of continuity and consistency, a continuous and consistent journey across the system if it operates through too many fragmented schemes. So that's one of the considerations that come with that model. But what I think it's interesting is really that this has, I mean, maybe one point to highlight is that it has resulted more as an organic process, kind of gradually realizing where the gaps were and kind of building kind of more kind of response-driven schemes for new segments that were coming under the spotlight as requiring a special treatment, let's say, and that this phase is now more of a phase of consolidation and integration and systematization. And also interesting that the approach is not very much sector-based, but it's more, if you want, employment relationship-based. So recognizing that there are certain employment relations that require a special treatment from the perspective of, you know, who you know, the affordability to pay, but also who can pay. So I do think that that's an approach that is more promising than taking a, let's say, pure sector-based model that really segments the labor market way too much, and it's maybe the model that Laura was referring to, for example, in the case of India. I'll stop here.
Thank you, Luca, for your reply. And then, I mean, in fact, like, labor mobility is an important issue. And as you said, I mean, in the informal economy, it's not even that workers move between employment statuses or sectors, but also sometimes they have multiple jobs. So that with such a system, it may also have its shortcomings. But I'm seeing that Fabio typed in his question. I'm not sure if you can unmute yourself, Fabio, but if you would like, I can. Yeah, I see he's unmuted. Please go ahead. Okay, I see maybe there's some problem with his microphone. So I think this question is addressed to Luca. Isn't the category-based contribution for non-salaried workers too complicated and demanding to really increase social insurance coverage? Not only in Tunisia, but also Morocco, very low level of adhesion. Morocco is going for a unique professional contribution that would ensure health insurance and family allowance, a very rare case, actually the only one I know that covers family allowance, and later unemployment benefit and then retirement pension. This seems to flag the insufficiency of the previous reform to attract non-salaried workers.
Yeah, I think this goes in hand with what I was referring, that somehow these countries have realized and are realizing the need or the opportunity to more systematization and kind of streamlining those systems, in order to reduce those elements of fragmentation where they are not necessary, where they add more complexity that actually help the system to operate in a consistent manner. And yet, I think recognizing again the necessity to distinguish the capacity to pay for, in situations of lack of enforcement but presence of an employer compared to situations of self-employment or domestic work, I think is an interesting feature that this model provides, and in that sense has been quite successful, I guess, in putting, at least in a certain phase of the history of the system in Tunisia, putting the spotlight on these groups of workers and dedicating to them a scheme and, let's say, a dedicated effort has also generated some visibility and some concerted efforts across different institutions to actually ensure increasing coverage, rather than living at the periphery of, let's say, unified system that never made them visible or made them a subject of policy discussion. So, and I think that, as I say, has been a progress of gradual reform, which, as Fabio rightly puts, is ongoing and surely will continue as these systems continue to evolve.
Many thanks, Luca. I think in the interest of time, we should move ahead to the second question because we only have 20 minutes left. So the second question, which received quite a lot of attention, is the question about, and I think we mentioned it before, so perhaps we can keep it short. We mentioned before, so how have countries managed to extend social protection to domestic workers? Are there any good practices? Before turning to Laura, who is based in South Africa, and I think South Africa may be a good example where we can learn from, I would like to give the floor to the participants first, whether any of you would like to share experiences from your country, challenges you are facing, or lessons learned you have drawn out of the process. Yes, so feel free. If you're shy, then you can also type in the chat box. Yeah, please feel free. It's a peer-to-peer discussion. Or would you like to break the ice, Laura?
Sure, thanks, Corinne. So South Africa, particularly in Africa, is probably one of the good practice examples of extending social insurance through the Unemployment Insurance Fund, the UIF, to domestic workers. In the early 2000s, there was a legal change which allowed domestic workers, so it's only domestic workers and I think farm workers who are allowed to contribute, who are not formal workers. The struggle to have self-employed informal workers recognized is still ongoing. But what was really innovative about especially at the time, was that it allowed contributions from multiple employers into the Unemployment Insurance Fund. And as many domestic workers have multiple employers, this really enabled coverage, more realistic coverage of domestic workers. So the domestic worker has to be registered by the employer, and it's a 1% contribution from the employer and a 1% contribution from the domestic worker to the Unemployment Insurance Fund, and the benefits are based on a sliding scale. I think it's a good practice example in terms of the innovations that we used and the fact that we have coverage for informal workers, at least legally. But I would say only about 20% of South Africa's domestic workers are actually covered by the UIF, and that became quite clear as a problem with the COVID-19 crisis, and the UIF instituted a temporary employer relief scheme to pay out benefits, and many domestic workers were just not included in that. I think one of the big problems so what the UIF did was then say, well, even if domestic workers are not being registered by their employer for the special COVID benefit, they can register themselves for the benefit. And also you can register with the scheme now. You don't have to have been registered before, and you can still qualify for the benefit. I think that one of the big problems with these contributory schemes and domestic workers is the requirement that the employer be involved in the registration, because that employer-employee relationship is in many countries is a hugely unequal one. And it can be very, very difficult to if you're a domestic worker, to argue with your employer to have you registered on the scheme. So I think there's a real need, and I've seen it in India as well with some of the work we've done with domestic, although theirs is a very different situation. There's almost a need to target employers with campaigns and information and a sort of whole drive to understand domestic workers' real work, and to ensure that they're actually registering employees. And I think also, you know, this new initiative to allow domestic workers to register with the scheme, aside from employers, outside of having to get registered by their employer, is great, but that's for the temporary employment relief scheme. And, you know, if the employer isn't going to contribute after that, you know, then how, you know, I've still got to learn more about this, but how would it work for the domestic worker who's now registered with the UIF but has no contributions from the employer? I should also say that there are some good examples in Latin America too. So I'm just speaking about the South African example because that's the one I have some familiarity with.
Oh, sorry, I saw that Christina unmuted herself. Please go ahead, Christina.
Yes, I know. I just wanted to add. I mean, when we talk about domestic workers and their social security coverage, I think it's an extremely interesting part of their overall working conditions. But I think we need to be aware is that the issue here is not just their social security coverage, but there is also a huge issue when it comes to their wages, when it comes to working conditions. A lot of them are migrant workers. Quite often there's really kind of a presence when it comes to violence. So I think it is all part of a bigger challenge when it comes to the situation of domestic workers, and I think really addressing the social security coverage for them, it's an important point, but it's difficult to address it in isolation. I think what is important really is a more kind of a much broader strategy also to address working conditions of domestic workers much more broadly, knowing that they're really an extremely vulnerable category of workers, and we know that, well, quite often, I mean, in many countries, they're excluded from legal coverage. But then even in those countries where there are the legal frameworks, which would in theory require their social security coverage, quite often it's not happening. And this is not the framework is not there. It is not being enforced. The mechanisms are not there. So I think we need to look at the picture in a much broader sense, and also think about what could be the strategies to really address it in the longer run, to use social security coverage as an entry point, but also then address the broader challenges. And I think that might be useful. Maybe I'll also take the opportunity to point you to a resource that Luca has mentioned earlier in the session. We have put together some good practices, considerations in a systematic manner in a policy resource package. And I'm going to share the link to the specific page on domestic workers in a moment. But I would also like to invite you to look at the booth that we have on extending social protection to workers in the informal economy, also together with WIGO. And there you will find much more information also on that. So this is part of the conference website. So yeah, just as an addition to that. Back over to you, Quinn.
Thank you, Christina, and thanks for underlining the importance of really promoting an integrated approach. Luca, would you like to add something? We just made you co-host, so you can present your screen if you wanted.
Yes, thank you, Quinn. I think it's only partly related to the question, but I guess I could I could share. I need to stop you from sharing, Quinn. I hope you don't mind. I would like to share some recent work we did in Jordan, which I find helpful in terms of sort of structuring this conversation about extension of coverage to workers in the informal economy. I hope you can see the screen. What we did is based on recent data from the Labor Force Survey. This is data from 2019, to sort of have a map, a visual map of where are informal economy workers located. And I mean, here we're only using 2 dimensions to look at this map, actually 3. We look at nationality, we look at sector, and we look at employment relation. And you can see from this picture quite a number of things. And really this has been quite useful, or is quite useful, to kind of guide and inform policy discussions which are taking place in Jordan from the perspective of extension of coverage. Of course, this is not is data prior to COVID, so the picture will probably be a little bit different, at least in terms of size of these boxes, as we account for COVID. But what is quite interesting is, of course, to see, I guess, the predominance of non-Jordanians as a share of the total number of informal workers. And within those, you see 2 large boxes here are domestic workers, as Christina was saying, regardless of the employment type. Large number of North Jordanian are outside the scope of the social security system, working in the domestic sector. But also, what's interesting is really to realize that there is really a high degree of heterogeneity in the type of employment arrangement. So not necessarily all informal workers are self-employed or casual workers. In fact, when it comes to Jordanian workers in particular, the largest groups are employees, and actually a large share of the informal workers, or if you want, the unregistered workers, are permanent employees who by all means should be covered by the law, but are not covered either because they are non-Jordanian and therefore they somehow fall outside the scope of legal coverage, such as the case of domestic workers, or in the case of agriculture, which is a special case, or simply as a result of non-compliance. And really this kind of mapping can help devise approaches which can look at how different strategies can be put in place, either focusing on enhancing compliance or on introducing, as we were discussing, windows or schemes that look at specific work arrangements, you know, be it on account, for the case of on-account workers, or the case of self-employed or casual workers. So I just wanted to share this as an exercise we conducted in Jordan. We found quite useful to kind of structure the conversation and realize the need for a multi-pronged response to the question, and really the need to think along all these different dimensions, over and back.
Oh, sorry. I had lost the Zoom. No, thanks a lot, and for that, I think this is really an extremely helpful way of looking things, because quite often we are talking about informal economy workers as if it was only kind of one type of worker, and looking at the diversity is extremely useful, especially when we think about possible policy solutions. And we're approaching the end of the session, unfortunately, and we have discussed only 2 questions, and there are many more. But actually, you might have seen in the page on this clinic that there is a virtual discussion document. It's a Google document, which actually already includes at least most of the questions, and we're going to complete it. And we would really like to invite you to contribute to that document. So that will be online for at least 24 hours. and looking at the names of participants here in this talk, and I'm not, well, actually, I mean, we haven't, Fabio hasn't managed to talk, and I think for most of the others have been quiet. But we would really invite you to contribute to that document. Add some experience, possibly also add some links to some documents that you've been working on. So I'll just put that Google document in the link to the Google document in the, oh no, I see that colleagues have, Quinn has already done it. So here it comes again. So we would really like to invite you to continue the conversation in writing in that document, so that we really can have, I mean, collectively this document, which really can help us to go forward in meeting this challenge and really extending social protection to those in the informal economy. And I think this is certainly a topic which is going to stay with us for many years. Given on the one hand, really the size of the challenge, but on the other hand also really the opportunities and the absolute need to improve social protection for workers in the informal economy. So let us just invite you to collaborate also on that document, to continue that discussion. And especially also to thank all of you and all the experts, especially Laura and Luca and Quinn, of course, for that discussion. Also the team at socialprotection.org who have facilitated the discussion. And so really, I mean, let's keep this conversation ongoing. And so I'm looking forward to the continuation of that exchange, maybe in some other means. So thank you very much, everyone. And I'm looking forward to that. And I just see that there is also a link for a feedback on this session. So please do reply. So I don't know, Quinn, Laura, Luca, would you like to share some final words? We have 2 minutes left.
I'll just say that I found Daniel Kumitz's question very good. And Daniel, I'll be answering your question on the discussion document.
Nothing from me. Goodbye, and thank you for a good discussion. Bye-bye.
Thank you very much for your participation, and have a good rest of the day or evening.
Yes, yeah. Thank you, everyone. Thank you. Goodbye.